I had an opportunity to go. I jumped at the chance because it was always something that was just, I wouldn't say it was like a burning kind of thing, but at the same time, it was one of those things that just wouldn't leave. And then once I was there, it was like, like a lot of people on their first time to Israel will say, man, it feels like home, or I just didn't expect it to feel this good here, or, it just connected with me in a way that I didn't expect or anticipate. And I knew from that moment, even if it would be another 20 or 30 years, I know where I need to come back to. It was that real, that tangible. It was that much of a calling and a pulling, I suppose you could say. And at that time, I don't even know that I would say calling. It was like this heart starting to burn, going like, man, there is something there that I can't explain, but I want to explain it.
Welcome to Along the Way. I'm John Matarazzo, your host and fellow traveler. Thank you for joining me along my way as I try to become more like Jesus every day. For this episode, I'm joined by my friend Doug Hershey, who has a special connection with Israel. He wrote and created an amazing book called Israel Rising: Ancient Prophecy, Modern Lens, taking old photos all around Israel and finding the same images from our modern day. It is incredible to see how biblical prophecy about the land of Israel is really coming to fruition in front of our very eyes. But we need to know where to look, so that's why Doug is our guide. In this conversation, we even talk about how the Dead Sea is coming back to life. I'll get to our conversation in just a moment, but as always, I want to thank you for listening to Along the Way. I hope that you like what you hear and that you subscribe. You can connect with me online as well. All of my socials and contact links are in the show notes, and you can check out all of my episodes at my website, alongtheway.media. There's an easy way to join my email list and find out more about me too. I hope that you check it out and you connect with me. I would love to hear from you. I also have a Patreon page if you want to help me to continue to put out these Along the Way episodes. If you'd like to become a Patreon supporter, simply go to patreon.com/alongtheway and select a level that you would like to join at. The link to become a Patreon supporter is in my show notes. And now, here is my Along the Way conversation with Doug Hershey. Well, Doug Hershey, it is great to have you on Along the Way. You and I have been friends for a couple of years now. You were a guest on my show, Real Life, a couple years ago, and you've been with us a few times. The first time you were with us, though, you were talking about your book, Israel Rising, which is a phenomenal book filled with amazing pictures from Israel's past and Israel's present, taken from those same vantage points. But it's not just a picture book. There's a bunch of stories in that, and I suggest to anybody that wants to learn more about Israel from what it's really like to get your hands on a copy of Doug's book. But Doug, I want to thank you so much for allowing me to join you on your journey with the Lord.
Yeah, man, I appreciate the invite. It's always good to catch up with you and see what you guys got going on, not only over at the studio, but this is my first time on your podcast. This is cool.
Yeah. Actually, just yesterday, you were on our HopeToday program. Real Life has changed its name, and now it's HopeToday. We've reformatted, rebranded, all that good stuff. And so I will be putting a link to that episode in the show notes, so you can check out that interview and stuff just by clicking the link there. But Doug, whenever we first met, you and I, we actually got a chance to go out to eat afterwards, which is a lot of fun. And we became friends pretty quick, which is always a great thing. I enjoy that facet of my job, that not only do I get to meet really interesting people, but I actually get to become friends with them and keep in touch with them. And so I want to talk about your journey with, your love for Israel and teaching people about that. And not just what has happened in the past, but what is happening now. So that's a little bit of a teaser. We're going to talk about what is happening in the land of Israel right now. But Doug, I want to hear your story and how God has brought you along your way.
Oh man, well, where to begin?
I know it's kind of a loaded question, but yeah.
Well, I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. It's funny because with a last name like Hershey, this is sort of like my shtick. When I'm doing, when I'm out speaking somewhere, people always say like, "Are you related to the chocolate people?" And the answer actually is yes, and distantly, but it's the joke is that not close enough for any free chocolate or any inheritance. So here I am, back and forth to Israel all the time. But years ago, I always had this sort of stirring in my heart in terms of Israel. One of the first, really most profound encounters I suppose I had was usually it's the unintentional ones, as we were just talking right before we started. It's usually the unintentional ones that seem to be the most meaningful. Well, My connection to Israel really started that way. I was in Jerusalem for the very first time with a group of Christians and Jews, and I'm standing on the Mount of Olives in this just really iconic, beautiful spot that overlooks the Kidron Valley. You're looking at the old city. It's a view that if you've ever seen Jerusalem, you've most likely have seen this view.
Sure.
So it was actually about this time. It was fall time around the Feast of Tabernacles. It was a warm, sunny day, and there's these beautiful white puffy clouds kind of rolling over the city, and I just had this moment where the clouds just really stuck out to me, and I thought, wow, those clouds look just like the type of clouds that roll over my house back in the States. And I had like this momentary revelation where it's like, wow, this is real. Like I recognize this place instead of it being a faraway, romanticized storybook Bible story of Jerusalem. It was real people, real horn blowing, real yelling, real city, real life, but with real prophecies and real promises from God. And this whole aspect of Bible prophecy for me, it was like the light turned on. It was like, this is real. Like this is an allegory. Like this is a real place that God is doing things in. And it really it set me on a path, not only in how I read the scriptures, but also really how I read the prophets. The more time I am in Israel, which is on a pretty regular basis now for the last 5 years, it's probably been 5 to 6 months of the year I spend in Israel, back and forth with different groups now with my travel company, Ezra Adventures. The more that I'm in Israel, the more of a Bible realist I become, because when the Bible says, like the waste and forgotten cities are being rebuilt, I've seen them. Like you can go to them, and when the deserts are blooming, like I can take you to those fields. Like everything that the Bible said is happening in a very tangible and very real way. So that first encounter for me, I don't. This was 22 years ago. I don't remember much else from that trip. But that maybe 5-minute period of time in Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives, when the Lord just kind of dropped that and stirred that in my heart, that was life-changing for me.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird to think like, I spent the money, you go on a 10-day trip to have a 5-minute experience, but looking back, like that's really almost the only thing I actually remember from that trip. And it was profoundly life-changing.
Yeah. So tell me about that first trip. What led up to that? Because, some people say Israel, that's just a place that I read about in the Bible, and what difference does that make? I'm in America right now, or I'm in whatever country you might be listening in. What is the value of going to Israel personally? What was the impetus for you going there?
I was already hungry for some things in Israel, mostly just out of curiosity and questioning. I would read the Bible and go, wow, there's Israel in the Bible, and wait a minute. There's a country in the Middle East called Israel. And then the more I started to read and to do a little myself study, thought, this is the same bloodline. Wait a minute. The same bloodline today is the same family of the Bible. And the light bulb started to turn on. So at that time, we were a part of a Messianic synagogue. I say we, my family at the time, and it was just sort of a new exploration. So I'm kind of feeling it out. I'm kind of like learning, like, okay, well, the Old Testament isn't so old anymore. Like there's some life there, and realizing, wait a minute, the Last Supper was really a Passover meal. Well, that's what Moses instructed Israel to do in Exodus. Like I started to put all these pieces together. And then I had, with this group that the congregation we were at was going for the Feast of Tabernacles, and I had an opportunity to go. And so I jumped at the chance, because it was always something that was just, I wouldn't say it was like a burning kind of thing, but at the same time, it was one of those things that just wouldn't leave, it wouldn't leave my heart. And then once I was there, it was like, like a lot of people on their first time to Israel will say, man, it feels like home, or I just didn't expect it to feel this good here, or, it just connected with me in a way that I didn't expect or anticipate. And I knew from that moment, even if it would be another 20 or 30 years, I know where I need to come back to. It was that real, that tangible. It was that much of a calling and a pulling, I suppose you could say. And at that time, I don't even know that I would say calling. It was again, talking about the Emmaus Road, it was like this heart starting to burn, going like, man, there's something there that I can't explain, but I want to explain it. And I need to pursue that and find out more.
I know whenever I was in Israel, I was there for 6 weeks from the middle of December 2003 to the end of January 2004. It was a life-changing experience. And it was a long time ago now. And so I would love to go back and see with fresh eyes a lot of the same things that we saw.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't go with the thinking that I'm just going here as a tourist to see things. I went on a mission trip to tell people about Jesus, which is not the easiest thing to do in Israel, is to tell people about Jesus.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Messianic people that have made their way to Israel, but that's a small minority. So it was a very eye-opening experience. I learned a lot, and it changed the way that I read the Bible. The Bible definitely comes alive whenever you read a place in the Bible and you're like, oh, I've been there. I know what that looks like. And one of my favorite places was actually in Engedi. And, I love that story where David's hiding from Saul. And like, I felt the presence of God there in a very unique way. And yeah, so Israel's a really cool place to get to experience, and it's not something that you can just look at pictures about it or a video, and those are all good things. You should definitely do that, but if you have the opportunity to get there, I definitely suggest to do it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's something with as people are asking about Ezra Adventures and small groups, and it's always sort of a bucket list, but I mean, man, it's I can't remember who said it. There's a famous quote, something about, one trip to Israel is worth like 10,000 Bible studies or something along those lines. But you hear people that come back from Israel and say, man, I'm reading the Bible like it's going from black and white to living color. Like there was just a dramatic change, and those things are true. And so, it is a maybe a $5,000 investment for a 10-day trip. Is that worth changing your life and how you read the Bible for the rest of your life? I think it is. Mm-hmm. Even if you don't connect the way to Israel that perhaps maybe I do, or other people that live there, if you love the God of the Bible, if you love the stories of King David, or a pickup prophet, even certainly with the teachings of Jesus, to be up in the Galilee and know that mm-hmm. this is where he did 70% of his miracles on the north side of the lake, and know what that landscape looks like. I mean, I'll tell my groups when I take them that it's there's so much of the geography that defines the story. In other words, you can read a story. Once you're there and you see the geography, you go, oh, I get it now. Like, mm-hmm. Just seeing how the hills roll and seeing how close the Mount of Olives is to Jerusalem, and just, seeing people walking around, you go, I get it. The light bulb turns on. And to me, that's to have an opportunity to read the scriptures much more clearly and connect with the Lord in that way. I mean, that's worth every penny in my mind.
Yeah. So, Doug, did you grow up in a Christian family? Has your relationship with the Lord always been there?
Yeah, my family heritage, through the centuries was Jewish, but I didn't actually realize that until much later. And it really wasn't even that I was looking for it or trying to prove any type of Jewish connection. Somebody gave me a book of family history and heritage, and at the beginning it talked about the Hershey family being Jewish, as if everybody knew it. But I grew up in a Christian home, and again, just always was sort of a regular Christian conservative denomination, and grew up kind of reading and figuring things out, and church youth groups and that type of upbringing. And then part of our connection with you and I was just with some of our experience in YWAM and some of those other getting involved in different things overseas, and a lot of different whether it be outreach or humanitarian aid related sort of stuff. So I always had sort of a drawing to the nations out of that. It was really birthed out of that upbringing in the church.
Yeah. So tell me about life before that first trip, because obviously that's one of the mile markers in your life. That's like everything's different since then. What was Doug's life before that, and how did that change? Because you now professionally are a tour guide and an author, and I don't think that was part of your original plan before you went on that trip. So kind of tell me a little bit about that.
So much of what I thought was the original plan is, like, for a lot of people, kind of gets tossed out the window. I'm 44 now, so 22, I was my early 20s when I went. So, I left a Christian high school, ended up going right into YWAM, into overseas related church building sort of stuff in other parts of the country, outreach service projects, and the stuff with Israel. Again, it never really started for me as I want to get involved with the nation of Israel or any type of politics or anything related to anything. At that point, it was mostly Israel is in the Bible. And if I can go somewhere, just the way that I went with like YWAM to learn more, like in a discipleship training setting, if there's somewhere where I can go to learn more about the Lord, I want to do that. If there's somewhere where I can go to learn more of the culture and the people of the Bible of whom Jesus came through, I want to do that. And so it really kind of came sort of this interest mostly out of just a hunger to learn. And some of that was, I guess sort of an early revelation, like I was saying, prior to my trips to Israel, of going, wait a minute, Jesus is Jewish? Well, I know some Jewish people. Is that the same family? Well, maybe if I want to get to know, it's like if when you get married or if you have a spouse or a really close friend, you can tell way more about them and what they're like once you meet their family.
Yeah.
And for me, I felt like that, it's true. Like so many of the teachings of Jesus are directly related to, like, there are very Jewish things that he talks about and things that he does and how he interacts with the disciples. It's a very sort of a Hebrew Jewish kind of way of communicating and interacting, as opposed to, how we're used to it in the West. And so and I've always had a love for history. So sort of that ancient history, some of it was just a hunger for learning, but some of it too is like, man, I really want to kind of dig into take the next step into Bible study, and not just, I'm a very like hands-on practical kind of guy. Like I don't want to just read about it. I want to dive in and get my hands dirty and make sure that what I'm reading is like legit,
Right. This isn't just a fairy tale that this isn't something that Hans Christian Andersen or the Brothers Grimm wrote, or Aesop's Fables. This is the Word of God that we're looking at, and you can go to those places. And I've had the opportunity to interview archaeologists that have actually dug in Israel, and it's just fascinating to know, like, even today, they're still finding new things. They're finding new old things, I guess. They're finding new evidence of old things. How about that? And so it's fascinating to know that basically wherever you go in Israel, you find that it proves that what the Bible is saying is to be true. Absolutely. And I was going to say, too, I mean, it's just some of the recent discoveries, there's been several more recent than this, but a couple years ago, probably now 4 or 5 years ago, it was pretty well widely broadcast, and I would take groups to go see it. But there was a little clay, it's called a clay bulla. It's like a little seal that had the name of Hezekiah, king of Judah, on it. And it was the first time ever where a biblical king's name was recorded in archaeology in the location where the Bible says that it was, in the time frame when the Bible said that it should have been. And so it was just providing, again, just sort of like this real life, no longer a fairy tale, real deal, real people. I mean, just if biblical archaeology, if the nation of Israel and biblical archaeology have shown us anything in the last 50 to 70 some years, is the Bible is accurate. It is remarkably specific and detailed, and it actually means what it says that it means. Yeah. And that's been sort of my journey, too, as I've been moving forward into sort of this aspect of Bible prophecy as well. The prophets talked about this 2,600 years ago. Oh, well, it's happening right over here, and I can take you to that hillside. And so to me, this whole aspect, whether it's archaeology, whether it's things in prophecy, to me, it just speaks of God's goodness and his kindness to not get bogged down in like theological, religious sort of jargon or interactions. Like, he's a useful, and this is even trite to say, I suppose, but he's a very useful, communicative, relational God who wants to be helpful, wants to walk with you on the journey, wants, not just give you a bunch of things that maybe you'll figure out once you get spiritual enough to ascend to that spiritual level or whatever. I mean, that's not him. Yeah. So Doug, how many times have you been to Israel now? Or have you stopped counting?
Yeah, I really have. I stopped counting. People ask. I mean, at this point, I usually keep track of how many months of the year that I'm there. Last year, in 2019, this is all sort of pre-COVID, but 2019, I was back and forth 6 times. And I mean, that was just the frequent flyer miles were like through the roof that year. But, on average, it's like 5, 6, maybe 7 months of the year. 3 years ago, I guess it was 2016, the year that I spent a lot of time doing photo shoots for Israel Rising and doing Ezra Adventures trips. It was probably 7 or 8 months of the year. So I'm pretty well kind of settled into culture and people and friends and locations, and really have a privilege to really get to know the country the way that many of your listeners would know their hometown. That's
Sure.
kind of how I know Israel.
Yeah. So Doug, you mentioned something called Ezra Adventures. Can you tell me a little bit about your tour company? Because you don't do normal tours, and I really want to get on one of your tours someday, because I think that would be awesome, because you don't do things that are just the normal touristy things. Tell us about what makes Ezra different, and where did it come from?
Yeah, Ezra Adventures, we started about 5, 6 years ago, really with the intention of connecting with the needs that are in the land. And so wanting to connect Western Christians to the needs. So, part of my struggle, and again, this kind of goes back to my original kind of revelation on the Mount of Olives, part of my original struggle was there are so many Christians that will come to Israel and enjoy the land for 10 or 14 days and go home with a very romantic view of what life is like there. And just everything's wonderful and it's the glory and it's all that kind of thing. None of those things are wrong. But the fact is that the people are people wherever you go. There are problems, there's issues. And the fact is that God is reviving this nation and this people in our time. And we have an opportunity to actually be a part of it, not just kind of look out a bus window and see what happened 2,000 years ago, but to get off the bus, get your hands dirty with local friends, and to actually help fulfill the pages of the prophets now. I think it's remarkable, just the time and the season that we're in. And so, and Ezra, in Hebrew, Ezra means help. So the intention was to be sort of help adventures in a way. So in a way to connect and to find out what the needs are and to really begin connecting with that. So in the last several years, we do adventure day trips, service projects or humanitarian connections, and then unique biblical sites. And so as far as the adventure aspect, we've done everything from snow skiing on Mount Hermon in the north to scuba diving in the south to desert camping under the stars in the Negev desert with Bedouins and camels and dune buggies and firearm training with special forces in the desert. And just, I mean, you name it, we can do it in Israel. And with service projects, I mean, there's stuff whether it's been building projects or restoration or food distribution with Palestinian Christians in some exclusive persecuted areas, working with Holocaust survivors. I mean, there's 101 things to get involved with. And then, of course, with the biblical sites, I mean, Israel has more archaeological digs, per square mile than anywhere else in the world. I mean, if you want to find the Bible, there's nowhere else to go. I mean, 80% of the Bible happens in Judea and Samaria, and right smack in the heartland. So, I mean, there's months and months and months and years of material there.
I read a news article saying that they were trying to build a parking lot somewhere near Jerusalem, and they eventually dug down a little bit, and it's another archaeological find, and they got to kind of shut down the parking lot to do the archaeological stuff. And I don't know if they ever got to do the parking lot, but it's everywhere. It literally is everywhere.
Funny, I know exactly that situation. 15 years ago, it was there's a parking lot as they're starting to do more excavation on the city of David, which is literally David's city from 3,000 years ago. They're finding more and more, and they're going, wow, this is going to be an amazing treasure. For the Jewish people and people around the world. We need to expand this one parking lot that's right over here across the street so we can move, get some buses in. We can increase the
increase the tourist revenue.
Make it more accessible, the whole thing. So they get in there, and of course what you have to do first is you have to get some archaeology in and do some boreholes just to make sure that nothing significant is underneath. Well, this is right outside the old walls of the city of Jerusalem, beside the city of David, of course. I mean, So anyhow, they ended up, 15 years ago, I remember parking in that parking lot, and now like the entire parking lot is gone. They've dug down in some sections of that dig. They've dug down to like First Temple period sort of stuff.
Wow.
It's just remarkable, stunning archaeology of literally the last 1,500 years. And so it's like, they're trying to expand it for more people to come, and they end up kind of making it worse than what they started with. But yeah, that type of situation is happening all the time throughout Israel.
Right.
Another place that happened, it's sort of another amazing story like that. But there's a place up in the north beside the Sea of Galilee called Magdala. And there was I want to say it was like some type of Catholic order that had gotten a piece of land, and they were going to do a retreat center. It's right on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. It's a beautiful spot. And they bring in the archaeologists to do their boreholes and figure out what's below. The very first drill thing that they put in, they hit this large stone, kind of dig it out. It's only about 10 inches under the soil. This was like an empty field. Mm-hmm. And they drill into what's now called the Magdala Stone, I think it's called, but it's this large stone that has these etchings on that I've never found before in Israel. But even more so, it literally lands smack in the middle of a first century synagogue. And so they begin excavating. This has been for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years now. But now it's like this amazing, incredible archaeological find that they didn't even know was there. And it was literally laying like less than 12 inches underneath the soil.
Yeah.
And why that's significant is that it's a first century synagogue. And the scriptures talked about how Jesus would go around and teach in all the synagogues around the Galilee. So I take our groups there and say, nothing is 100% guaranteed. But
right.
According to the scriptures, there's a 99% chance that he was teaching right here. Like, this is one of the communities, because it turned out to, the more they've done the research, they're finding just incredible stuff. But all of that started with somebody saying, hey, I want to build something here. And then the blueprints go out the window.
Yeah, of course. So, but interestingly enough, Israel's being built up all over the place, and you go to it now, and it's amazing to see what's been happening. But you came across a treasure trove of old pictures, and then God gave you an idea about taking these pictures and comparing them with new stuff. Can you tell me about what eventually became the book Israel Rising?
Yeah, so originally I've always had a love for history and these old black and white photos. When you're in the old city, of Jerusalem, you'll walk down some of these little streets or side alleys, and you see these shops that have these little black and white photos that are maybe like a 5x8 size photo of like some of the gates around Jerusalem that where the places are. You just walk by that particular photo, but it looks like it's a completely different world from 100 years ago. So instead of cars out front, there's camels or whatever else. And so I had gotten 2,200 of these old photos in a drive and started flipping through them and kind of shrunk that down to about 100, and then went back with a pro photographer to reshoot a lot of the angles. And that became the book Israel Rising. And so I fully expected when I did that book that Israel Rising would probably be an advertisement. That was my intention. Israel Rising would be an advertisement for Ezra Adventures. And, on down the road that maybe I might be even on the book or something like that. But, that whole story really just turned into what we call it Israel Rising, ancient prophecy, modern lens, looking at an ancient prophecy and then viewing that prophecy through a modern lens. That whole theme has now become a series, which is now on my website at doughershey.co. There's a new online course, 10 prophecies fulfilled in our lifetime, as part of the Ancient Prophecy Modern Lens series. Again, they're taking 10 different prophecies and going to the places and looking at that through photography and video and to document how that's unfolding. But I didn't realize at the time about sort of what that might even become. Like I said, I was thinking more about Ezra Adventures. And since that time, I'm like ready to pass Ezra Adventures on to some other people to run it, so I can kind of double down and focus full time on Next summer I'll have a new book, Jerusalem Rising, coming out. I have content for other media options on down the road that will fit with under this ancient prophecy modern lens, because we are living in what I consider to be a Daniel season of time.
Okay. And what does that mean? Explain
in
that.
Daniel, in the book of Daniel, he's in exile, and he's reading the prophet Jeremiah, who Jeremiah says Israel will be in exile for 70 years. Daniel realizes, wait a minute, it's been 70 years. Like, now is the time for the prophet's words to be fulfilled. And instead of just saying, God, it's time, like, I'm just going to sit back and watch you do it, he gets actively involved in the process. And he says, in prayer and sackcloth and ashes, I want to say this is Daniel 9, I think. I could be wrong in the number. But he's basically into sackcloth and ashes and repentance and prayer, and just saying, God, now is the season. What are you doing, and how can I join you? I think that we're in the same type of season of time, in that now is the time where Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Amos, a lot of these prophets in the scriptures, their words are coming to pass in a very tangible way. And we can sit back and go, wow, this is really cool, or I picked up this book or saw that online course. But there's an opportunity for us in our day, like we were talking earlier, whether it's Ezra Adventures or somebody else, to find a way to get to Israel and find a way to be involved. We have an opportunity to literally fulfill the pages of the scriptures in a way that our parents or our grandparents would have never dreamed. And so I just think that God is just, for whatever reason, we've been chosen to be alive in this time in the season when a lot of these things are happening. And it kind of resonates with me some of the Lord of the Rings quotes of like,
oh yeah.
We can't decide, kind of when the time is. I'm paraphrasing. I'm screwing up the quote, I know, but basically it's like, make the most of your time. Like, we're not choosing when we can live, but here we are, and now what are you going to do with the time that you've been given? And so that's kind of how I view our time with Israel. Is like, for centuries and centuries and centuries, people have longed to return to Israel, longed to return to Jerusalem, let alone see it become a nation whose technology and discoveries and modern advancements and on is literally changing the world. We are living in a time that has never been seen before in terms of Bible prophecy and history unfolding like that.
Yeah, and prophecy really is unfolding all throughout our modern time. And it's amazing whenever you read the Bible and you see these things that are actually happening. And we're going to talk about some of those from your course in just a moment. But as we're talking here, Doug, there was Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, visited Israel. I forget what year it was, but it was the late 1800s.
1867.
1867, yeah. And he described Israel as desolate, barren, and basically good for nothing. And it's an interesting thing to know that it's like 150 years ago, but now God has totally revitalized the land, and the technology and the agriculture and all the stuff that is coming out of Israel truly can only be explained by God's hand is on that nation and that land. Before we jump into your new course, I don't want to forget to ask about this, but you have some great stories in the Israel Rising book. It is not just old pictures and new pictures. There's a lot of stories that you've put in there as well to tell how you got some of these pictures. Can you just tell me one of those before we start talking about your latest course?
Yeah, and so I write these short little blog entries called Personal Encounters, and because that's really what it was. And in the course of the photo shoot and prep for the book, I'm trying to figure out. I've got a pile of old photos. I'm trying to figure out where they're at, and even if it's an option to recreate. And so, one in particular is we're in Jericho, which at this time it's under the Palestinian Authority, what's referred to as Area A. There's no Jews that are allowed. It's under Palestinians' civil control and security control. And so, but it's relatively more of a sleepy town, and I had some friends inside that could help us out. So I had this old black and white photo of some old stone archway from the late 1800s, like 1890 or something like that, and a barren, empty field behind it. And I thought, man, this is a this was a ruin in the 1890s. I don't even know if that's even going to be an option. So we went into a market, and there's a bunch, and just really, I really began learning this was sort of the way to do things if I was kind of lost or needed some answers. But find a bunch of old men sitting around drinking coffee, arguing about politics in the morning, reading the newspaper or whatever, strike up a conversation and say, hey, I'm doing a photojournalism project, or I'm doing some history research. And this is Jericho from 100 some years ago. Would you happen to know where this is at? And I'm thinking, like, this place was this picture is showing me stone ruins from the 1890s. There's no way it's still going to be standing. He takes one look at it and goes, oh yeah, that's the old sugar mill over, And so he hops in my van and he says, but first we need to go over here. So we go to his brother's, shop, and we have coffee and a little bite to eat. And, it's just sort of part of Arab hospitality. But eventually, like, he takes us right to the sugar mill, and I'm kind of stunned to go, like, I'm looking at this, grainy black and white photo from, I think it's 1892. And I'm looking at the same stone archway sort of through the bushes a little bit. But what's amazing is behind that stone archway in 1890, there's absolutely nothing. And today there's a whole sprawling, landscape of life and green. And so there were just really some amazing kind of treasures. So when, again, when you're talking about sort of your theme of finding things along the way and finding the way that God kind of leads you very unexpectedly, that was a lot of the joy of, and really, I mean, it is the joy of doing a lot of these research projects. It's like, it's like X marks the spot. Where can I find this, and who can I find that can help me find it? It's just been so fun. It's like such a fulfilling sort of adventure and journey of putting those things together. And so I write about some of those within Israel Rising and Jerusalem Rising as well. There'll be some coming in there as well.
So you put together this book, and it comes out on the 70th anniversary of Israel becoming its own nation.
Right.
So it came out in 2018, and I started seeing you on all kinds of TV shows. Of course, we had you first, at least that's the first time that I saw you, but I started seeing you on Jewish Voice and all these other places. And so it was really cool to see, like, hey, people are really interested in what is happening, or what has happened in Israel anciently, but also in the near history, but what's happening today. Books are great because they're in print and they don't change, but things are just happening so fast in our world today that you have actually developed an online course, which we were just talking about yesterday on the Real Life program. Which we were just talking about yesterday on the HopeToday program, Old Habits Die Hard. And so this course focuses on 10 prophecies that are coming to life as we speak. Can you tell me about some of those and what people that want to check out your course can expect to see?
Yeah, again, and so I'm taking these prophecies from a very literal and a very tangible way. Sometimes we read the Bible and we go, well, in fact, some of it we talked about yesterday morning about reading something about streams in the desert or making the desert bloom. And, in our world, we think of that as going, just saying like, well, I know that God can bring life out of a completely dead and desolate situation. And all of those things are true. But the fact is that Israel is the only place on earth today that the deserts are shrinking and not expanding, because they are literally finding streams in the desert, and the desert is blooming because of the farming that's happening there. So, I mean, so when we talk about those types of passages, we look at it from a very tangible section and then going to the actual places where they're happening. And so some of the prophecies that are in there are about the return of the Jewish people. The most repeated promise in your scriptures is that God will bring his people back to the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so there's a section on that. One is about one of my favorites is about these Dead Sea springs.
Yeah, me too.
In Ezekiel 47, there's a prophecy that talks about there'll be a day when the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea, will become fresh, and men will fish out of it. And we read that and go, the Dead Sea right now, it's 10 times saltier than any other body of water on earth. The chance of me figuring out how that's going to happen is very little. So that probably means that God didn't really actually mean that. He must be speaking symbolically or metaphorically.
Right.
Well, and Mark Twain goes through that area as well, and he talks about it that it was like it reminded him of death and of funerals. and there was like nothing there. And
it's not a pretty picture. Yeah.
Yeah, not at all. And so, but what's been happening is since the 1980s, it didn't happen before. It's only been happening since the 1980s, where these sinkholes have been starting to open up on the Israeli side, not on the Jordanian side, but on the Israeli side of the Dead Sea. And geologists were trying to figure out what is going on, and they sent some researchers in. And what they're finding is that everywhere, and I'm shortening the story really, but everywhere there's a sinkhole, there's a freshwater spring that is popping up from underneath the earth, and that is weakening the soil content, or diluting the soil content and weakening the soil structure and causing everything to collapse. And so now there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these sinkholes that have swallowed up portions of the road. In fact, not far from En-Gedi, you were talking about being close to En-Gedi. They've had to rebuild the road around En-Gedi. There's these beaches that I used to take people to 10 years ago on these trips. A lot of them are closed down, and they're not safe. And so the water level in the Dead Sea is dropping 1 to 2 meters a year. So that on average, that's 4 to 7 or 8 feet a year, depending on the year. And so that's the equivalent of about 600 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water every day that is evaporating or disappearing.
Every day.
Every day.
Wow.
I mean, it is ridiculous, the amount of water. And so the Dead Sea at its longest point is about 30 miles long, and at its widest point is about 14 or 15 miles wide. So this is a huge lake or body of water. But because there's been less water flowing into the Dead Sea from the Jordan River due to all of the irrigation that's happening through the Jordan Valley, the water's been evaporating. So quite literally, historically, and we didn't even talk about this on the show yesterday, but what's happening is that because there's less water flowing into the Dead Sea and evaporation, the Dead Sea is dropping at a rate like has never been seen before in history. People are fearing that if it continues, that the Dead Sea potentially could be gone by like 2050, 2060. So another 30 years or so, continuing at this rate, there is going to be a major, potentially could be, who's to say? God knows what he does for sure. But isn't it interesting? At the same time, for the first time ever, that the levels of the water are dropping, these freshwater springs are popping up at the same time. And so in this prophecy fulfilled course, we actually go to these springs. There's like green marshes. I'm standing in fresh water that's literally right beside the Dead Sea. And at one point at the very end, I have a little cell phone video where I'm on a boat and I'm watching fresh water coming up from underneath the Dead Sea, literally bubbling up through the water. And so like these are just amazing, stunning things. Now, in the context of Ezekiel 47, the context is that there's an earthquake and there's a river flowing from Jerusalem. But the fact is that never before has there been any type of fresh water, anything at the Dead Sea. Mm-hmm. And now it's happening in a really profound and dramatic way that has absolutely nothing to do with the hand of man. It's just happening, and people are watching and wondering it. And so there's life that's starting to pop up. And so anyhow, I talked a lot about that, but that's just one example. There are 10 different prophecies that we look at and spend time, and all of these are, I think the shortest one is like 5 minutes. The longest one is like 18 or 19 minutes, and so it's not intended to be a TV show. It's sort of it's a meaty packeting kind of thing. Get the information. I have my teaching notes and further resources there on each individual video. And so at my website, doughershey.co, your listeners can get for free. You can get the first one, and so they can log in, and so you can get it. And that one is about 10 minutes long, about the miracles surrounding the establishment of the state of Israel, about some of the miracles during the War of Independence, and there's a common mistranslated scripture in there about Israel that is really just a special little nugget there for those that really enjoyed diving into what God was really saying, and all of that's in about 10 minutes, and so you can get that for check out the course if your listeners are kind of fascinated by that whole thing as I am.
Yeah, so that's at doughershey.co. I'll be providing a link for that in the show notes as well. And I can definitely verify that this is a really well done course. The video work that you've done with that, it's not just Doug in the desert carrying a cell phone, making videos and putting it up online. No, he actually has people working with it, and it's well done. And Doug, you said something in that last little bit there that, these sinkholes, this water that is coming up that's fresh, it's not being done by the hands of man. And I find that so interesting, especially with biblical prophecy, because sometimes people read the Bible and they say, well, that Jesus could have just manufactured this thing, or people could have manufactured that, or people came back to the land of Israel, but they just read that, and so they're going to try to fulfill that themselves. I guess you could make that argument, but with some of those things, not all of them for sure. But whenever the land itself is literally coming back to life, it's something that has been dead, and we know that dead things don't randomly strike up life normally. And so we know that God's hand is working in that land. And so we are seeing some really interesting prophetic things happening. We're recording this September 16th, and yesterday, September 15th, was a big day for Israel as well, because they signed the Abraham Accords. There's now a normalization between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Israel and Bahrain. Supposedly there's more on the way, and hopefully, by the time that this podcast gets out, we might actually find out more about those. But Doug, what does peace in the Middle East mean in regards to ancient prophecy and modern lens?
In terms of the whole over scoping region, sometimes people are saying like, well, is the peace accords, was that really in Bible prophecy? Is this coming to pass? Is this the Bible talks about that, for instance, in the war of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39, where it talks about nations gathering and coming in on invading northern Israel. But the reason they do that is because they are jealous of Israel's wealth and of the peace and security that they have. And they're coming to like steal silver and gold and cattle and the whole thing. So at some point, the scriptures talk about Israel being in a place of peace and of security. And so just the fact that these peace agreements are being made, and some people are saying, well, it's all setting it up for the Antichrist. Maybe this, listen, man, you can look and spin negative things as much as you want to spin them. Mm-hmm. And with this, even with this 10 prophecies fulfilled things, that's part of why I'm wanting to get it out there, is like, listen, there's profoundly encouraging, positive things that are happening. And truly, there's not going to be the fullness of peace and shalom until Sar Shalom, the Prince of Peace, has arrived. Mm-hmm. And both Jewish and Christian circles would certainly agree on that. But in the meantime, God is continuing to work out His plan, and what that looks like in terms of interpolitical type of international espionage kind of stories, behind the scenes sort of stuff, whatever that looks like. The fact is that for any nations that are making peace that used to not be at peace, that is a profound step and godly blessing. There is no curses found in peace that's being made, in a truthful and a positive sort of way. And so, to me, I think it's all encouraging. I'm one that's an optimist, looking on the bright side, looking for what God is doing, not what God is about to crush and to step on, and how people are being deceived. Listen, there's lots of people that are talking that way, and even with some of them, I might not even disagree with them. But just in life in general, we have an opportunity to look at things that are positive or things that are negative. You get to decide, how you want to, look at life and look at the things around you. And there are so many exciting things that are happening in Israel and the Middle East in terms of Bible prophecy that just simply hasn't been the case. And so I'm hoping that as these peace accords become more and more solid, the whole pandemic thing kind of settles down. I'm hoping that means that many, many, many more millions and millions of people will be able to go to Israel and to have the encounters like that you've had, that I've had,
right,
where they just go, wow, there is something different about this city and about this location. And so, at some point, Zechariah 14 talks about that all nations will come to Jerusalem. They're already starting to come to Jerusalem in a way that the earth has never seen before. And so the more that people in Bahrain and the UAE and other Arab nations who had never had an opportunity to come to Israel and in that experience now have an opportunity to do that and do so safely, that's a blessing for them. And I hope that there's more nations that have that opportunity.
Yeah. So, as these things are happening all around us, Doug, it's really easy to miss those things that God is trying to get our attention on if we're not paying attention. I want to ask you, the theme around this podcast is what has happened in your life that has showed you that Jesus has been walking with you, but in the moment you didn't realize it until you look back much later? Yeah,
some of it would really have to be with this whole process with Israel Rising. I was talking about it, earlier on. I didn't intend to start a career path as an author or a writer. I was happy just kind of doing these exploration, fun,
right.
Indiana Jones, experiential sort of fun, off the beaten path stuff with Ezra Adventures. And I thought, hey, this would be a great way to show Israel to people that might not ever get a chance to come. And it's funny, when I first putting these details together, I had some people that were helping me. And one was an Orthodox rabbi in Jerusalem. And he at one point, as we were talking in his office in Jerusalem, he says to me, no one's ever done this before. No one's ever done this type of then and now photography with history and Bible prophecy. Like this. He said, I'm just letting you know, like something that you're this thing that you're working on is really special. Like this, and I almost felt like he was prophesying to me at that time. And he said, this could really be your life's work. Like, I could see this being volume 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like this could be going on for the rest. There's so much for you to be able to document in terms of what the prophet said would happen and how it's unfolding. And at that time, it was like, that was way too big for my brain. It's
definitely overwhelming.
Completely, 100%. Number one, I'm just thinking about, Ezra Adventures and bringing so maybe, growing a company that way. And number two, trying to figure out, am I even going to be able to find all of these black and white locations? How is this going to work out? I mean, there were so many hoops to jump through, and he's already talking about, like miles and down the road. And so I kind of just kind of laughed and was like, and I think I even said to him, like, well, let me get through the first one. And then if that one goes okay, then we will talk some more. But looking back, I mean, it's like this Orthodox rabbi in Jerusalem had more faith for some of these projects than I did. And looking back, I really heard the voice of the Lord through him, looking back and going, this is where you're going. And so here I am a few years later, and he was absolutely right. I'm looking for, not looking by, I have some other people that are running Ezra Adventures and kind of taking the lead on that, so I can completely focus more on writing and more on doing the research and the documentation and exploring the land and putting out content, like, especially now when nobody's traveling, but to be able to bring you 10 different prophecies filmed at these really unusual, exclusive locations in Israel for the viewers, to bring Israel to them and the truth of what God is doing. I'm excited and, truthfully a little humbled and honored that I have an opportunity to do it.
For sure. So Doug, if you could go back in time and visit a younger version of yourself, tell me what's going on in that scene, and what advice would you give yourself?
I'd say, don't be stupid.
Don't be stupid. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't be, when I'm 44, and I think a lot of your listeners would recognize that, when you're in your early 30s, you're trying to make things happen, and you've got lots of idealistic views, and you've learned a little bit, but enough to be dangerous, I think you could say. And, I would have never dreamed that, 7 years ago, that I would even be stepping into what I'm doing now. And so, a lot of it came through hardship. A lot of it came through, hardship and failure is a wonderful teacher, and so to be at a place where I can look back and go, wow, I really fell on my face a few different places. And it was because I was pushing too hard in the wrong direction. And if I would have just kind of leaned back and not been so hard-headed, I mean, I tend to be a pretty direct, hard-headed person to begin with. And so, I would think that that's probably one of my number one thing is just that settle down, listen to the Lord, and follow His leading. And you really don't know what you think that you know. That would probably be one of my biggest things for me.
Yeah, I think that's something that we all need to realize is that we don't know what we think we know. We need to rely on the Lord a lot more than we do and allow Him to reveal things to us and
for sure.
Be humble in that process, for sure. So, Doug, what is a life verse that is something that has always grounded you to?
For years and years, I've always been very much of a visionary kind of, wanting to go beyond. And so whether it's sort of an adventure aspect or just like I was saying earlier, like, man, I want to learn about the Bible. I want to go to Israel. Like, I just think about those types of things. So Psalm 37 verse 4, delight yourself in the Lord and He'll give you the desires of your heart. And I realized, early on was that, God wasn't interested in, locking me into something boring and awful and terrible. He was interested in me delighting in Him. Mm-hmm. And if I'm completely honest, as you get busy with other things, and as you get have a little taste of success, and as you kind of get in the groove of where you feel like you're going, it's easy to forget to back up and to spend some time delighting and just kind of not just following the Lord's leading because you have to, but because you want to, and delighting in that, and realizing that if can we really trust Him to, if we do that, back up and do that, will He really come through? What about all of these desires that I have in my heart? Are they His desires? Are they my desires? Does it matter? Does it matter to Him? Does He like to give good gifts? Does He like to walk hand in hand? I mean, there's a lot of these things that we wrestle with, mostly because we just simply don't trust whether or not He'll actually do it. And so it's going back even as a kid, I'd probably say that was something that I had lots of desires in my heart. And I knew that the only way that I was really going to obtain some of those and to really kind of touch some of those was just to lay it at the Lord's feet and say, like, hey, this is what you've put in me. This is who you've made me to be. But I'm going to do my best to kind of surrender that to you and just to delight in you. And I think some of your listeners would probably, agree that when David in Psalm 51 talks about restoring to me the joy of my salvation, when you start the road, it's pretty exciting, and it's easy to see those things and be all in. But after following, you talk about the road to Emmaus here. I mean, after you follow the Lord for 3 years, day in, day out, and this whole thing didn't end the way that they thought, they're complaining, they're discouraged, and they're frustrated, and they're trying to figure out which end is up and what's going on. And so, I think that's one of the biggest challenges for sure, is continuing to take the time to do it.
So, Doug, what's some advice that you would give to make sure that you're continuing to press in with the Lord? Is there any books that you like to read or resources that you would recommend?
For me, I find a tremendous amount of life in the Psalms. And I hate to, sometimes people say, like, where do you learn about like all of this, Bible prophecy? And I'm like, the Bible. Like, if you read that, like, it'll make sense. So I really enjoy, I really enjoy just spending time like reading through the Kings, and especially now being in the land and knowing some of the locations and kind of having the map in my head.
Right.
But that's one thing, and that's one in particular. I was putting me on the spot here. I can't really think of anything that's. I'll think of probably like 50 of them after we're done the podcast. But I like to be around people that, or connect with people that I'm hungry from. Like I want what they have,
Sure.
And to kind of spur me on and to stir me on. And so, one of those guys is Joel Rosenberg. Mm. So, and now I've just, with Jerusalem Rising, I just recently signed a book deal in Tyndale. So I'm now a Tyndale author, which is what Joel is as well. And so I've always appreciated Joel's view of taking Bible prophecy and then applying it in a very practical way on sort of an international level and what all of that looks like. And so Joel's one of those guys that was at the Abraham Accords, taking pictures in front of the White House and that kind of thing. I have a little man crush on Joel, and as far as his research and kind of where his life is going and how it, as a follower of the Lord. And so, I really love. I love anything that will take biblical truths and apply them in a very practical, tangible, real international nations, kind of level. Like that kind of stuff really stirs my heart.
Yeah. So we had Joel Rosenberg on Hope Today the day before you.
No kidding.
Yeah. So
that's funny.
I'll have to put the link for that episode in there as well, so people can see who this Joel Rosenberg guy is. And
he's phenomenal.
So that's great. Doug, we've talked a whole lot about your experience in Israel and how that has changed your life. And yes, 80% of the Bible happens in a small area of the world, right in the corner of the Mediterranean Sea, right there. The Israelites are God's chosen people, but I'm so grateful that God has grafted us in, and it's through Jesus Christ. And Doug, it all points to Jesus. That's the biggest thing that I've learned from my time when I was in Israel. Would you just talk about who Jesus is for you and maybe make an introduction for somebody that doesn't know him?
Yeah, I mean, part of my work, even with the 10 prophecies fulfilled, or even with Israel Rising, is that after, like, even with the story of Israel Rising, the land's been desolate for hundreds and hundreds and a couple thousand years. The Jewish people return and it revives. Well, why is it reviving? And aside, if you take the New Testament out of it, you have this amazing pattern that by the time that Jesus steps on the scene, there's something already laid out. And according to the prophets, is that the Jewish people will be thrown out of the land, and at some point they're going to return to the same piece of real estate that God would bring them back to. And when they do, that the physical land will respond, and the waste and forgotten cities will be rebuilt. God will multiply them on, man and beast on the land. The deserts will bloom. It talks about that the nation will again, there'll no longer be two kingdoms, but there'll be one nation called Israel. And then then the floodgates will open. Like, all of those things have happened in the last 100 years in a way that have never happened before. But it's all leading to something. It's not just that God is making the land look pretty again just for the heck of it. It's not just like, I made a promise, but it's all pointing to the fact that at some point there is going to be a Jewish man, a Jewish king from the line of David, who will arrive on the Mount of Olives and enter Jerusalem to rule and to reign. And so when we talk, for me, I'm kind of getting to my personal connection here, is that, again, the more that I've been involved with researching and documenting this stuff, the more I realize, like, this is all leading to something. Like, this is all very clearly coming. So it's, if the people have returned, the nation is called Israel again, the land is responding, the people are being multiplied. Israel is blessing the nations again, and now at some point there's going to be a change where all nations will be against Jerusalem. What do you think is coming next, according to the prophets? There is a king, a Jewish king, that will return. And when Jesus ascended on the Mount of Olives, the angel said, like, this is where he's coming back to. Like, as he left, you're going to see him come back. And so, for me, this aspect of Jesus and believing in the Lord, and not just simply believing from the theological aspect, but having some concrete experience. There are too many historical anomalies around the Jewish people, around the land, and everything that the scriptures said that would happen. The scriptures also talk about a Jewish king returning to the land and ruling his people, Israel, and ruling the earth from that location. So even for Christians, when Jesus talks about returning, it's not to New York or to Hong Kong or to London or somewhere else. He's returning to a Jewish Jerusalem, period. And so the fact that all of these other things are lined up, in fact, in even the time at Pentecost, and this will go, I'll try to shorten this as quickly as I can here, but in Acts 3, Peter is teaching after Peter and John, heal some guys. And he's saying that that heaven will hold him, talking about Jesus, they're already talking about the return. Heaven will hold him until there's a full restoration of everything that the prophets talked about from ancient times. Now, if you go back and look at what every prophet in the scriptures talked about, every single prophet talked about the restoration of Israel, whether it's Obadiah, Nahum, even Jonah talks about turning his face, in the belly of the fish, turning his face towards the temple and, kind of recentering. Every single prophet talked about the restoration of Israel. And so Peter is talking to a Jewish crowd and he says, this is what it's about. And that heaven will hold him. There will come a point where heaven will no longer be able to hold him. What is that point? It's the full restoration of what all the prophets talked about since ancient times. What was the one common denominator they talked about? It was the restoration of Israel. So here we are in a time when Peter says, the Lord is not returning until there's a full restoration of the nation of Israel. What do you think is happening right now, and what do you think is coming next? Mm-hmm. So, all throughout the scriptures, both Old and New Covenant, there's this connection between those two. And so for me, it isn't just simply, something I believe, or I read some theology that makes my heart feel warm. It is this process of walking the land and experiencing the things that not only the prophets talked about, but a lot of the disciples and the apostles talked about in the New Testament as well. It is very clearly leading to something, and the Bible is very clear about it. And so there is a very soon, who knows? I mean, this is even now still hard to wrap our earthly mind around, but is it true that perhaps in our lifetime a Jewish king will be ruling Jerusalem and ruling the earth from the line of David, doing amazing things as was foretold by the prophets? If we've believed all the prophets and all of the other stuff, we have to consider that as well. Yeah. And so for me, this is sort of when I was talking about at the beginning about being a Bible realist and being a literalist in terms of Bible prophecy, this is part of it. And so as the land is reviving, as the people is returning, even Ezekiel says he's going to bring them back, and then he's going to pour out his spirit on them, and then he's going to bring a cleansing. And so God clearly has a plan. He's regathering his people, and according to the prophets, it's for a cleansing, and it's to encounter him and to bring everybody into the fold of what his plan was. And I believe that was through Jesus, through Yeshua, the Messiah.
Can you just tell somebody how they can begin that restoration process, lining up to God's plan?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it just comes down to acknowledging what's going on in your heart and saying, wow, I need somebody to step in and change some things. And aside from an earthly king ruling, there is one who will deal with our sin problem. Eventually everybody has to have the question, how will I account for my sin? Like, how will that happen? And again, if we're talking about the prophets and what they foretold, there would be one who would come and make sacrifice to bring that about in right standing. And again, he is a Jewish man. Mm-hmm. So all of that's just simply in my mind, just simply recognizing that what God is doing and saying, yes, I'm yielding myself to you, and let me follow your lead. Show me the truth. Show me who you are in person that I can follow.
And Jesus is faithful with all of that. If we ask him to save us from ourselves, to forgive us of our sins, and the Bible says that if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. But we need to turn over control of our lives to Jesus so that we can be in line with him, so that we can be part of that restoration of God's plan, so that we can be in good standing with him whenever he does come back, whether we leave our earthly bodies first through death or Jesus does come back. And as we're looking at this world today, we're seeing so many crazy things out there. It seems like every other day you got to just read through the book of Revelation to see what chapter we're in. We need to be ready, and we're seeing Israel come back to life. We're seeing the land come back to life. We're seeing people respond to the call of Aliyah to return. And so it's amazing to see what is happening right before our eyes. And if we're not paying attention to what God is doing, we could miss it. So I just want to encourage everybody that's listening to check out Doug's books and his series. You can find that information at doughershey.co. Doug, I just want to thank you so much for being my friend, but also doing the tremendous work that you're doing to help bring awareness and education and just inspiration so that people can learn what God is actually doing. And you're not going to see some of the stuff that Doug's talking about in the headlines, but it is happening. And we got to be aware of what God is doing and be a part of it.
Absolutely.
So, Doug, thank you so much for allowing me to join you along your way.
This has been great, man. Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed my Along the Way episode with Doug Hershey. You should really check out his website to see how you can get your hands on his current book, Israel Rising, and also his video course. You will learn so much. If you can't get to Israel with Doug, this is the next best thing. I'll be providing his links in the show notes. Thank you for listening to Along the Way. If you've enjoyed joining me along my way, please share this with a friend who you think will be encouraged by this podcast. Also, please rate and review Along the Way on iTunes. That helps more people discover Along the Way. And subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and at my website, alongtheway.media. I hope that you've enjoyed this part of my journey, and may you realize when Jesus is walking with you along your way. Along the Way is honored to be part of the Charisma Podcast Network. You can find tons of spirit-filled content from their vast catalog of podcasts, including my Monday through Friday news stories for the Charisma News Podcast. Go to cpnshows.com to see the full list and latest episodes.